Let's go ahead and get started. Welcome to the second webinar in a series presented by the APA Codes and Standards Council. My name is Billy Zadig. I'm the Standards and Codes Administrator here at APA. This webinar is being recorded and will be made available on the APA website. If you have questions, please type them in the chat box and we will answer the questions in the order they are received. The Standards and Codes Council is made up of a group of people, and they serve as a permanent council reporting to the APA Board of Directors. Work on the Standards and Codes Council can be found at www.apa.org/standards.cfm. The members of the Standards and Code Council are listed on this slide. The Council's mission is, as stated on this slide, promote standards and awareness to its member institutions. The Council presently monitors relevant standards and codes activities for more than 20 national, global standards development organizations and government agencies. Among the organizations that are followed most closely are NFPA, ASHRAE, ASME, and the International Code Council, ICC, which is responsible for the International Building Code. The APA also collaborates with the organizations identified above. Again, the focus of this webinar is the OSHA standard for the control of hazardous energy, more formally known as Title 29 of the Code of Federal Regulations, Part 1910-147. Our presenter today is Ted Widener. Ted has been interested in buildings since he started in an architecture program over 40 years ago. He began his career in construction and facilities by representing a college theater group in the renovation and expansion of the building they occupied, and he has never left. That one project led to increasing responsibilities and over 30 years in leadership roles in higher education facilities at 6 different institutions. During those years, Ted learned from others and attempted to share what he learned through presentations to colleagues at conferences and through programs for his staff. He now teaches at Purdue University in the Division of Construction Engineering and Management, where he is developing a program that focuses on facilities and infrastructure. Dr. Widener is a frequent writer on facility issues in higher education and is active in APA, serving on its Facilities Professional Certification Board. He is also a member of the U.S. Technical Advisory Group to ISO TC 267 and the ISO TC 267 Workgroup 3 Chair, representing the U.S. in developing international standards for facilities management. It is my pleasure to now introduce Dr. Widener as our presenter today.
Welcome, everyone. You may be asking, what is the OSHA standard for the control of hazardous energy sources? It is the standard that addresses practices and procedures necessary to disable machinery or equipment, preventing the release of hazardous energy while employees service and maintain equipment. These sources may be electrical, mechanical, hydraulic, pneumatic, chemical, thermal, or some other energy form. What must employers do to protect employees? The standard establishes that employers must follow when employees are exposed to hazardous energy while servicing and maintaining equipment and machinery. Some of the most critical requirements of these standards are development, implement, and enforce an energy control program. Use lockout devices for equipment that can be locked out, and tagout devices may be used in lieu of lockout devices only if a tagout program provides the employee protection equivalent to that of a lockout program. Ensure that new or overhauled equipment is capable of being locked out. This means major capital renewal projects should have lockout capabilities included in the design and/or replacement work. While design engineers should know about this requirement, if you decide to do your own capital renewal or major maintenance project, you must be aware of the requirement too. Develop, implement, and enforce an effective tagout program for machines or equipment that is not capable of being locked out. Develop, document, and implement and enforce energy control procedures. Continuing on, use only lockout, tagout devices authorized for a particular equipment or machinery. Ensure that lockout, tagout devices are durable, standardized, and substantial. Ensure that lockout, tagout devices identify the individual users. Establish a policy that permits only the employees who locked out or tagged out a device to remove the lockout or tagout. Inspect energy control procedures at least annually. That's a big one, and we're going to talk about that a little later. Provide effective training as mandated for all employees covered by the standard, and then comply with the additional energy control provisions in OSHA standards when machines or equipment must be tested or repositioned, when outside contractors are at the work site, in group lockout situations, and finally during shift or personnel changes. Some equipment cannot be serviced when your own personnel or by your own personnel or in a single work day. In these cases, operating and maintenance personnel should be made aware what equipment is locked out and understand the implications to the operations and/or maintenance activities. So what should a lockout tagout procedure have as a minimum? All maintenance personnel are to be provided with a good lock. The lock shall have the individual worker's name and/or other identification on it. Each worker shall have the only key to the lock. Some organizations assign locks to employees for their entire employment. Others may choose to distribute locks at the beginning of each maintenance effort during a normal review of the work plan as part of the safety review. The worker shall check to be sure that no one is operating machinery before turning off the power. It'd be kind of surprising for a machine operator to suddenly lose power, and that could cause an accident. Steam, air, or hydraulic lines must be bled, drained, and cleaned out. There shall be no pressure in these lines or in reservoir tanks. And then any mechanism under tension or pressure, such as springs, shall be released and blocked. Ensuring these potential energy sources are restrained is very important. Each person who will be working on the machinery shall put a lock on the machine's lockout devices. Each lock shall remain on the machine until that work is complete. There are many lockout devices that allow for multiple locks to be applied to them, so they can be used in this case. All energy sources that could activate the machine shall be locked out, either blocked or tagged. The main valve or main electrical disconnect shall be tested to make sure the power to the machine is off. Electrical circuits shall be checked with proper and calibrated electrical testing equipment. An electrical failure could energize the equipment even if the switch is in the off position. Stored energy in electrical capacitors shall be safely discharged. Finally, when working on machinery such as power presses and welding presses that have a ram that could fall, the ram shall be supported with safety blocks or pins. Fully interlocked safety blocks are the safest. After hearing all of this, you may be wondering, how can I get more information? OSHA has various publications, standards, technical assistance, and compliance tools to help you, and offers extensive assistance through its many safety and health programs. Workplace consultation, voluntary protection programs, grants, strategic partnerships, state plans, training, and education. They have a lot of tools available. Guidance such as OSHA's safety and health management program guidelines identify elements that are critical to the development of a successful safety and health management program. These and other information from OSHA are available at the OSHA website, www.osha.gov, and some of the additional information provided on the screen. Let me talk a little bit about the training verification, because that's a big one. We had a Code Talkers article in the March-April 2017 issue of Facility Manager magazine, because it has serious implications for those of us who may be faced with budget pressures. The Code Talkers article can be found at appa.org/codetalkerarticles.cfm. So more on the inspections. Strictly read, the rule says any energy using equipment has to be checked to make sure the people performing maintenance on the equipment know and can perform appropriate lockout tagout procedures and be observed doing so on an annual basis. In other words, every piece of equipment that operates with energy must have people performing the service being observed doing the lockout tagout procedures annually. On the surface, it sounds like you must have an observer tag along during the annual PM of every piece of equipment to make sure the mechanics de-energize the equipment correctly. In other words, if a job takes one person, you have to have another one tag along just to observe. That sounds kind of bad. And if there was no annual PM planned, you still have to go through the lockout tagout steps to make sure the equipment can be de-energized correctly. You know, and some of this makes sense because it's important in the event of an emergency that the worker must de-energize the equipment in order to be safe. Really, the goal is to make this all seem like second nature, like walking. But the trouble is the apparent amount of workload associated with it. So fortunately, one of the things that we wrote about in the article was that there's an easier way to tackle this problem and be compliant with the rules. So let's talk about that. First, we have a general assumption that there is a complete inventory of all equipment at your facility. Now, that can be a big assumption, but it's important if you're going to minimize any extra work and control your budget. You should have some kind of maintenance management system with all the energized equipment that is going to be maintained. A CMMS is the best way to keep this information, but you can keep it on paper if that's the way you work. If you haven't got a clear list of equipment, I recommend you start developing one. The next assumption is that all equipment, of similar function, size, and operation is known. This will make it a lot easier and less costly, as you'll see below. For instance, in a laboratory building, there may be multiple VAV boxes that are virtually identical and can be serviced following the same procedures. Know these devices and be able to show that you require the same procedure for all of them. Third, all employees similarly trained in lockout tagout procedures and are available at least once a year to talk with the inspector about lockout tagout procedures. As part of your annual lockout tagout refresher for all employees, it's easy to take a little additional time and have employees meet with the inspector or auditor to demonstrate their awareness. Next, let's look at how to get a grip on observing and documenting lockout tagout procedures for all equipment. To save time, separate lockout tagout procedures for similar equipment where the procedure utilizes the same or similar types of control measures can be grouped together and comply with the regulation. That is, if there are 100 air handlers that have all have similar devices to control the flow of energy to the air handler, and the procedures for these similar devices are the same, then the inspector may observe the lockout tagout procedures for 1 unit instead of 100 units. A representative group of employees, which means it could be one, may be observed doing the lockout tagout procedures. Every employee is not required to perform the lockout tagout procedures in front of the inspector. Again, doing this as part of an annual refresher on lockout tagout policies and procedures will save time and resources. The inspector's records of employee interviews, observations of lockout tagout procedure compliance, and all associated notes should be documented and stored for future inspection in the event that OSHA comes to call. Remember, if you don't have documentation that something has occurred, then the assumption is it did not occur, and you could have a problem. In summary, make sure you know what equipment must have lockout tagout procedures in place for safe maintenance of the equipment. Have a complete list of these stored and saved with all other important facility records. If you don't have lockout tagout procedures for all equipment, get started gathering it. Refine the list of equipment so lockout tagout procedures are known. For instance, a single procedure can apply to many pieces of equipment. This may save on documentation and training needs. Recently, I was going over some preventive maintenance records for a university where I've done some consulting work and saw that they had clearly identified in the CMMS data they provided similar PM procedures for different pieces of equipment, and they were associated with each piece of equipment. So they had a good system. Identify all unique lockout tagout procedures and identify the employees who must be familiar with the lockout tagout procedures to do their job safely. For instance, to maintain electrical equipment, you might have all electricians trained on lockout tagout procedures for all electrical equipment. It really depends on the kinds of assignments you give the electricians. However, for components such as a major air handler, it may be necessary to have electricians, plumbers, and HVAC technicians all trained on the lockout tagout procedures for the air handler, because each one of them has energy coming in from a source where they're responsible for the maintenance. Each of those employees must have their own locks and understand how to work together to de-energize the air handler, work on it, and then re-energize it after all work is complete. Finally, estimate the time for each lockout tagout procedure. The sum of the times for the list becomes the total time needed for the inspector to observe the minimum number of procedures annually to ensure compliance. At the time of the annual inspection, add the time for the annual inspection to the PM schedule. That way you're able to plan your preventive maintenance and the time needed for the inspection and include enough time for the documentation. That pretty much summarizes our presentation. If there's time after some Q&A, why we will review the results of a survey that APA conducted in March of this year about lockout tagout compliance. And as Billy had mentioned, we will also include links to references that you may find helpful with additional information after this webinar. So Billy, if there are any questions from the audience, let's start answering them.
Thank you, Ted. We have a couple of comments here. Ted, in Kentucky, tagout is not acceptable by itself if the equipment can be locked out in any way. Both must be used. Can you explain how state regulations may vary or, you know, with OSHA and all of that?
Right. Some states have their own OSHA-like program or office, and it has been recognized by the federal government that a state may have its own OSHA. When I was in Illinois, there was an Illinois OSHA that we had to comply with, but the standards are pretty much the same. But more specifically to the question, and consistent with what I was saying in the presentation, although I may have passed over it too quickly, you can use tagout only if you can't already do lockout. So for instance, a piece of equipment that doesn't have an appropriate lockout control mechanism, or a control mechanism that can be locked out by putting a hasp through a set of holes, or putting a lock through a set of holes or a hasp, you have to use a lockout if that exists. If it doesn't exist, then you have to tag it out, and your procedures have to provide the same protection for the employees doing the work as if it had a lockout on it. So I think everything is consistent. If you can lock something out, you have to lock it out. And each lock has to have the employee's name on it, so you know who put the lock on. And that would be consistent with tagging things. It's just that you have a lock there, and you know who put the lock on.
Thank you. Our second question is, can only electricians lock out equipment, or can trained maintenance personnel flip a circuit breaker or otherwise lock out a machine?
Depending on who you have maintaining equipment at your facility will really make the decision as to who can apply lockouts. The concept here is that the person who is maintaining equipment that could be energized locks out the energy source. So if you have a maintenance technician who is authorized and capable of doing electrical work, they can lock out a circuit panel or a circuit breaker with the appropriate equipment. The government is not or OSHA is not telling you who can do the work. You've made that decision, and you're documenting your decisions on working safely in the procedures that OSHA requires you to have.
That is all the questions we have in the chat box for now.
All right. If there are additional questions that come in, we'll tackle them. But in the meantime, let's look at the survey results so you can see what was expressed earlier. So we first asked the question, does your institution have lockout tagout procedures in place? And the good thing is that over 96% of the respondents indicated they have lockout, tagout procedures in place for their institution. And I hope after this, the 4% that remain understand the importance of developing those procedures. The next question is which organization in your institution is responsible for executing lockout, tagout procedures? And we allowed multiple answers for a single organization. And given that some of our institutions are rather large and may have more than one maintenance operation, the answers make some sense. But over 88% of the organizations replying said the physical facilities or the O&M area was responsible for lockout, tagout. The next one, interestingly, was the environmental health and safety or the campus compliance office. And that's a little confusing to me because they generally don't supervise the O&M people, but they may have put the procedures together. And then training by human resources, and then again for a large public institution, they may have an independent residential life or dining program, and so they're responsible for lockout, tagout procedures of equipment in their areas. The real trick here is to make sure that the lockout, tagout procedures are clear on who's responsible for which piece of equipment, so that there's no finger pointing. There has to be a clear line of responsibility in the event an accident occurs.
Ted, may I interrupt you with a couple more questions?
Sure.
How is the control of electricity verified? Do you need a meter to touch a potentially live wire?
That's exactly how I read the standard. In other words, to verify that the power is off, you've got someone with a VOM or other device to verify before you touch the contacts. That may not be a big deal for 110, but so many of us have equipment that runs at 480 volts, and you don't want to feel that one.
Okay, our next question is, can lockout, tagout locks be used for general purpose locking of other equipment such as lockers?
I would say that's a very bad procedure. A lockout, tagout lock is, number one, it's a little bit more expensive because it's durable and it meets some OSHA standards. And it just doesn't make sense to put the device that's going to save your life on your locker that may only have a few personal effects in it of less significant value than your life. So I would treat a lockout, tagout lock very differently from a regular locker lock. If that's the way you want to handle things, I think you're making a mistake.
Thank you. How can you know if a locked out piece of equipment still has about 160 volts still running to it? Not enough to start it, but enough to kill.
Yeah, again, that's the reason for testing a piece of equipment where you have, or testing the electrical power coming into the equipment where you believe you've already turned it off, because there could be some kind of back voltage on it. I'm not an electrical engineer, so I don't know how that could happen, but I understand that since you can't see the electricity, you need to test for it somehow.
And our next question is, what is the best practice for maintenance going longer than a typical shift?
Well, let's say you've opened a boiler up to test to see, or just to perform annual maintenance. So you're checking for any kinds of leaks or thinness in the tubes. Even a large chiller, you're going to open up and have it open for more than 8 hours, several days, to do major renewal or annual maintenance work as part of your PM schedule. So that's an example. You're going to cross over several shifts while that piece of equipment is offline. And people need to be aware that it's offline for operational reasons. They need to be aware that it's offline and they don't try to accidentally open up something that they're not supposed to and endanger the life of somebody else. It's also important that there be a clear handoff if you have more than one crew doing work in an area where equipment is tagged out, that they understand some pieces of equipment may not be operational, or that they've been locked out and tagged out and they can go in there and work safely. But frankly, if they go in there to work safely on a new shift, they should apply their lock to the lockout device. And the employee who's coming off would remove theirs so that if the maintenance work is completed in the second shift, then the equipment could be started up again if that's the way you're working. But you don't want to leave the equipment that is open. You don't want to leave the opportunity for it to get re-energized while it's still open and being maintained. So a clear procedure on how to have a change of shift or a change of work assignments and people putting their lock on and the group coming off, removing their lock afterwards, that's what you have to spell out.
And that's the conclusion of our questions we have up until now. So shall we proceed with the next slide?
Let's go to the next slide. With which of the following lockout tagout requirements as mandated and described by OSHA does your institution comply? Check all that apply. Ideally, we would have seen 100% for everyone. We didn't. Not many of you are, well, it's less than 60% are documenting the enforcement of energy control procedures, and fewer than 50% have an annual inspection of energy control procedures. Hopefully after this webinar, that number will get much closer to 100%. And I'm still a little bit surprised. 7% indicated that they did not have employee training on lockout tagout. And I'd say that that's a pretty important thing. If you haven't done it, you want to make sure that you're doing it to protect the life of all of your employees. Next survey question was for lockout tagout responsibilities managed by your facilities or physical plant department. Do you use a contract for the purposes of executing lockout tagout procedures and managing compliance requirements in one or more of the following areas? The first one, my institution does not use a contractor. The above compliance requirements are performed in-house. Was replied with less than 1%. Not quite sure about that. I would normally have assumed that they would have answered differently. Use lockout for equipment that can be locked out. We should be closer to 100% on that one. We're only at about 61%. Use tagout devices. Tagout devices really should only be used when there's no lockout capabilities. So that's a little confusing as to why, if there's 61% are using lockouts, well, I'm not going to analyze it. It's a disturbing response. Documentation is down around 33%. That needs to be closer to 100%, and same thing for energy control procedures inspection. Only 1/4 of the respondents inspect for compliance. That's a risk. Go back and look at the article from the March-April 2017 issue of Facilities Manager magazine. Last, when we asked these questions in March, which of the following scenarios best describes your institution's understanding of OSHA lockout, tagout compliance obligations? We had a little over 42% saying that their staff was thoroughly knowledgeable. I think maybe we're going to do our online poll. Is that what we were planning on doing here, Billy?
Yes, and it'll be our next slide, but we had a couple more questions also come in.
Oh, okay. So let's do the questions, then we'll do the poll.
Okay. Would you review again what the lockout, tagout information on the equipment should read, tech, etc.?
I'm confused. The lockout, tagout, you should know what kind of employee, whether it's a technician, electrician, plumber, whatever, who is going to be working on the equipment to do the preventive maintenance or maintenance in general work. And you need to know that they have been trained on the lockout, tagout procedures for that piece of equipment. Does that answer the question?
He'll bring it up, but we'll move on to the next question.
Okay.
Does OSHA require a competent person to stay at the site of the lockout, tagout to ensure no one other than the workers access the locks?
The whole concept of the worker having the only key to the lock should eliminate the need to have someone standing around watching the lockout devices.
Okay. The person answering the question clarified it. For the lock itself on the equipment, what information should be available?
On the lock itself, the lock should have the name of the employee who applied the lock on the lock, so you can find that employee if they're not at the work site. If someone believes that the equipment is ready to be re-energized, but there's still a lock on the lockout device, you need to know who to go look for to say, how come your lock is still on here?
He said, thank you. That's exactly what he needed to know.
All right, great.
Okay, the next question we have is, should the same worker need several days on a job, what should he do at the end of his shift? Does he remove his lock and reapply it the next day?
Okay, if the equipment is open and in the middle of being worked on, it doesn't make sense for the worker to remove his lock at the end of the shift, particularly if he's going to come back the next day. You don't want equipment re-energized by mistake when it's open. If the worker is handing off to another worker to continue to do work, then you can have an exchange of locks in the lockout device, as I had said before, so that if the equipment is ready to be re-energized during the second or third shift, and you have a problem if the person on the first shift's lock is still on there. But if you're only going to have one shift perform the work on the equipment, the lock should stay on until the equipment is ready to be re-energized and all the workers are safe. Does that make sense?
I think you've answered the question. Next question.
All right.
Similar to the previous question, is it okay for a supervisor to hold on to an extra set of his employees' keys?
As I read the OSHA regulations, the answer is no. Now, when you're dealing with a recalcitrant employee who says, I'm going to lock a piece of equipment out because I'm not happy with what management says, that's really a different problem. The whole concept of lockout, tagout is that when an employee is working on a piece of equipment, they lock that equipment out so they don't get hurt. And the supervisor should be fully supportive of that and should not attempt to make a decision for the employee who is doing their job. So if you've got a supervisor who feels they need to have a key, I think the supervisor needs to go to some training.
Okay. Does a descriptive danger tag hung with shop and person's name on it with the lock replace the need for the name on the lock itself?
That's not the way I read it in the OSHA standards, but maybe someone who's in the environmental health and safety area might say that that would be adequate. You really need to know who applied the lock, so that you know who claims to be doing the work.
Okay, we have one more question as of now. When you do a handoff from one technician to another, such as from one shift to another, do you need to document the handoff?
I think that's a good idea. I don't see it required in the regulations, but I think it's appropriate that you have a documentation of more than one worker working through more than one shift, maintaining a piece of equipment. You can, and you can do that with good record keeping in your CMMS.
Okay, one more question just came in. When you do a handoff from one technician to another, such as from one, oh, excuse me, that was already done. In regard to the question earlier about using a lock for any other purpose, the answer is a lockout device can only be used for the purpose of locking out. 1910 Ward 147 C52 states, shall not be used for other purposes and shall meet the following requirements.
That's great. I like it.
Okay, well, that concludes our questions at the moment. We can go on to our...
Okay, so we're going to do a poll after all of these questions. Here's the answers that we got back in March. So 42% are thoroughly knowledgeable, 47% are familiar, but don't have a full understanding yet. So after this webinar, how would you vote now? Do you still feel comfortable that your staff is fully knowledgeable and competent in this area, and that your institution is highly confident that it is addressing all compliance requirements? Or is the policy in place, but the staff is familiar with implementing procedures, but may not have a full understanding of the purpose or intent of the procedures, consistent in updating and maintaining records and inspection reports may still be a challenge for you? Or would you choose the third one, our institution is in need of an established lockout tagout procedure and policy to ensure that compliance and obligation under the OSHA requirements are met? Or finally, other, which I would assume to be you're not in compliance in any way. So let's try to answer the poll, and we'll see if the numbers have changed any. Part of me wants to believe that they've gone a particular direction. I don't want to sway anyone's opinion yet. I'd like to see how effective our survey or our webinar has been.
And right now, 47% of our attendees have voted. So we'll leave this open for a few more seconds, and then we'll go ahead and close it. Or would you like to leave it open and go on to the next slide?
No, let's leave it open for a little while for people to think about it. And
okay.
The other challenge that we have here is we don't know if we're getting the same sample or if It's a different sample. It's probably a different sample. So I won't use this for scientific purposes. Maybe when we get to about 80%, since we have such a large audience, we can close the poll and move on.
Okay, we have a new question. Do we have to have the lockout tagout procedure actually posted on the machine or device, or is it sufficient just to have the procedure documented?
The procedure should be documented. It doesn't have to be posted on the device. Unless you've got a device that's out in public, and I'd have a lot of concerns about having energy control equipment for major building equipment out where folks can get a hold of it. As an example, I don't particularly like unlocked electric panels in public corridors.
Okay. Well, it looks like our attendees have stopped voting. So
all right, what are the results?
The results are 40% of staff is thoroughly knowledgeable, 39% is familiar with the procedures, 15% said our institution is in need of established procedures, and we have 6% with other.
Well, unfortunately, things trended the way I was afraid they were going to, which means we all have some work to do. Because really the goal is that 100% answered that top question. And at the very least, the top two questions should total 100%. Those folks who answered in either of the bottom two questions, I would say you got a lot of work to do, and keep your fingers crossed that nobody gets hurt, because OSHA will definitely come onto your campus and it won't be pretty. And hoping is not a good enough excuse.
Okay, we have another question here. Does the standard require posting of the lockout tagout procedure directly to the equipment being locked out?
I thought that was the earlier question that I answered.
I think it's very similar to the same question. Yes, I apologize. I didn't check.
Oh, no problem. If it's not, let's ask me again. I thought I answered the question.
Okay, we have no questions at the moment. Would you like to move to our next survey result?
Let's review of the survey, and then we can tell folks about some other things.
Okay.
One of the things that was driving this webinar was the response to this question: Would your institution benefit from additional information and training? And the answer was 66%, or 2/3 of the people wanted additional training. So we have responded to that. If additional training is still required, we'll have to see what other things that we can do, whether it's going to be providing a white paper or a more formal presentation at a conference. We'll see what we can do. I don't have the, or at least I must have missed the responses that would have said what the additional training should be in. Well, let's look at the next question, Billy. And then the last question on our survey was, does your institution carry liability insurance on behalf of the institution and its employees to protect itself in the event lockout tagout procedures are improperly conducted? And interestingly, there's a lot of folks who have some kind of liability insurance. Now, it's not clear, the liability insurance does not absolve your organization of the need to comply with OSHA, but it may help reduce the financial hit associated with any fines. But it doesn't prevent an injury or death. You really do need to comply with OSHA's lockout, tagout procedures. So that's the results of our survey, and again, one of the reasons why we had this webinar. Billy, do you want to talk about some of the other things that the Standards and Codes Council is doing?
Yes, I also want to mention before we go on to our next slide is APA has a publication that touches on lockout, tagout requirements and other regulatory obligations impacting educational facility organizations. It's entitled The Environmental Management Guide for Educational Facilities, and it's available on our website through the bookstore. We also have a Campus Safety, Health, and Environmental Management Association recently published in the 2017 edition of the popular guide. And on this next slide, it tells you how to get to our bookstore, which if you go to www.apa.org and in the orange header, click on bookstore, and then you can go into, it's got another line of blue tabs, and if you click on any of these, it'll help you go through. This is specific instructions on how to download the new standard, the draft standard that we have, APA 1000. So if you go through this and you add it to the cart and all, and then it will then give you instructions on how to download it, and it is free to members.
And I'm sure that the Total Cost of Ownership Committee would appreciate hearing any comments that folks have about the standard that they're developing. They have until when to comment, Billy?
September 19th.
So a little less than a week remaining.
Correct. And then as we close out today, next month we'll have another Codes and Standards webinar. It'll be on the Chemical Facility Anti-Terrorism Standard, more commonly known as CFATS, on Wednesday, October 11th from 11 a.m. to 12 noon Eastern Time. It will be presented by Maureen Coltis, and she is from the University of Maryland, College Park. We will be sending, you'll get information through your email sometime close to the end of this month for the webinar. So, Ted, I'd like to thank you, and I don't see that we have any more questions. Would you like to say anything in closing?
Appreciated the opportunity to make the presentation today, and everyone be safe.
Thank you so much. And again, thank you for attending our webinar, and hopefully we'll see the majority of you at our next one. Have a great day. Goodbye.
Billy, you still there?